Welcome back everybody to our studies in A-level history for AQA. What we're going to do in this video is continue talking about imperial and colonial policy, focusing on the administration of India between around 1587 to around 1857 to around 1890. So we are still on the part of the specification which concerns imperial and colonial policy. And the AQA specification makes an important point about the specific administration of India. The reason for this is because during this period we have to reconcile with the challenge to the Indian Mutiny. Something that is going to be touched on again if you look a little bit lower down when we look at the relations with indigenous peoples section as well. So we're going to be talking about the Indian Mutiny in quite a lot of detail at multiple different points, partially owing to the fact that it was a particularly significant element of the sort of nature of imperialism at this point. And so this is obviously why it's important, but also because it had quite a significant impact on the way in which India was administered during this period. So this is going to be a video which examines the application of imperial and colonial policy in relation to that of India, the administration of India. And really, prior to the Indian Mutiny, we see that there was an expansion of British control over India, and that this was originally overseen by the British East India Company. For the most part, chartered corporations were those who were in charge of quite a lot of the imperial and colonial parts across most empires, in fact, more than just the British Empire, but also Dutch empires, Spanish empires, etc., etc. Under the control of the British East India Company, millions of subjects had been added to the empire by way of conquest, expansion, and annexation of territory. And so, of course, you would see that because India was such a large part of the world, the subcontinent of India, you would notice that this was a very expensive task, a vastly expensive task. In fact, one quite interesting part of this is that the cost of the government in India was actually not that much less than the cost of government in Britain itself. And the army that was stationed in India, that was under the control of the British East India Company, was considerably larger than the ordinary military forces that existed in Great Britain. So it was almost a significant government in and of itself. The East India Company, the British East India Company, had been granted a monopoly over English trade with Asia in 1600s, and since then would continue to grow in terms of its administration, grow in terms of its wealth and its power, and grow in terms of the people who had been employed as part of the sort of military garrisons in India. And it would rule India until 1858. So from 1600 to 1858, the administration of the Indian continent, or the Indian country, the state of India, was done under the auspices of the British East India Company. We then get the 1857 Indian Mutiny. The mutiny actually hit the British Empire particularly hard. It had lasted a year and led to the deaths of thousands of people. The British sent troops to bolster the support of the East India Company, which really showed the desire on the part of the British Empire to maintain control and retain the control over India itself. There was a significant amount of control that the British wanted to exert over that of India. And with that being said, there was also the view that if, of course, there was a lot of desire on the part of the British and the British Empire to actually control India, the result of this meant that there would be it would be very clear that a new administration would need to exist to run the continent of India instead. And so this is really where we see the end of the British East India Company. It was dissolved in 1858 and India itself was put under the control of the British government. That same year, in 1858, we see the Government of India Act being passed in Parliament, which does a number of different things. It establishes a number of provisions. Firstly, the East India Company is dissolved. and the company's territories are transferred from their control to that of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria then becomes the new controller of India. There was then the creation of a new executive department, this being the Secretary of State for India, the Department of State for India, which was obviously concerned with the territory of India itself. It received power and duties that were formerly performed by the East India Company. So it basically replaces the East India Company with the Secretary of State for India. The new territories become part of the auspices of control of territory by Queen Victoria. And there was also a council that was of 15 members that would be appointed to assist the Secretary of State in the quite arduous and significantly large task that they had before them, given how difficult it was to control India, given how large a place it was. In addition to this, the Indian Civil Service would be placed under the control of the Secretary of State as well, basically taking on the task that the East India Company had been performing for so many centuries at this point. And so we see the administration of India take place under this new administration. The Viceroy, who was the replacement, if you will, of the company Governor General, would rule India with a legislative council. So previously to the dissolution of the East India Company, the company was in control by a Governor General. This was appointed. This was replaced, by the appointment of a Viceroy under the auspices of the Crown. And so they would rule with legislative control. This consisted of 5 members and 5 different areas of policy. They would be in control of finance, they would be in control of law, they would be in control of military, and they'd be in control of the economy. All of which, and of course 5, and also of home affairs. These were the basic areas of administration that would be under the auspices of this legislative council at the behest of the Viceroy of India. During the years of the Raj, it was the priority of the British government to maintain control over India. The Raj period was this of 1858 to 1948, when we start to see the partition of India towards the end of the British Empire, as the British Empire goes through its process of a very slow collapse, which we're obviously going to get to in a future lesson's time. Running the Raj actually required quite a vast amount of staff, maintained by around 1,000 British civil service members, and the position of a number of the civil service within India was a very sought-out job. It was a very good job with a very good salary, and so it was something that was seen to be also a point of high status, in addition to all of the other elements that came with the job, like I just said, a good salary. There was also the need for there to be cooperation with the natives, with the indigenous peoples of India. We will talk about the relationship between the British Empire and indigenous peoples in future lessons' time. But what should be noted is that the Viceroy relied on native rulers in charge of around 565 nominally independent princely states. So the administration of India was not something that was done at a centralized point. It was done at the behest of native rulers who had control of around 565 independent princely states. There was also this view known as the doctrine of lapse. The doctrine of lapse simply stated that a princely state would fall under British control, under British rule, when the line of descent ends. So the princely state would continue to be under the auspices of the people who were in charge, the Indian natives who were in control of these princely states. When their line of descent ended, however, the doctrine of lapse would mean that the princely state would fall under British rule as a result of the death of the last person in the line of descent. When it comes to administrative functions, these were performed by an array of officials. These included things like the collection of taxation, the maintenance of law and order within India, of course, this being very, very important at the end of the fact that we have the Indian Mutiny that was, of course, very much a significant cause for concern. They ran courts and judicial institutions, And really what happened was a legal system developed when the old East India Company would merge with the Crown and the Crown Courts and English law. And so we start to see the development of this new creation of a sort of merged legal system between both the old system of the East India Company and the new Crown system that existed, which would generally try to apply principles of English law. Generally speaking, however, from the position of the Indian population, the shift from the rule under the thumb of the East India Company to the rule under the thumb of the Crown actually made very little difference to the day-to-day lives of these individuals. In some sections, the Indian population showed an increase in political awareness. So, for example, in 1885, we see the establishment of the Indian National Congress, but for the most part, there was very little in terms of major significant changes to the day-to-day lives of the Indian population when we see these shift away from company rule to crown rule, because fundamentally the crown just performed very much similar tasks to that of the East India Company. But one of the new things that had been added to the roster of things that had to have been administered in India was to prevent any further mutiny from taking place. It was very, very clear that the Indian mutiny had a significant impact on the interests of the empire. Not only the mutiny itself, but it also made it very, very clear that the British had to instigate quite a number of important policies to prevent any other kind of mutiny in the future. So, in 1858, we see there were efforts to strengthen the British Indian Army as a result of the Indian Mutiny to try and make sure that they could be able to squash any rebellion that could possibly start to develop. The East India Company's armies, all the significant control, were brought under the control of the Crown. All of the armies that were the significant army that was under control of by the East India Company would then be brought under the control of the Crown. This ended with over 70,000 British troops and over 125,000 native Indian troops existing and being garrisoned in India in the late 1880s. Policies to ensure that there would be no native regiments situated together to ensure that the mutinies would not take place were also implemented. So these 125,000 native troops were distributed and dispersed as much as humanly possible across garrisons, across the whole part of India that was being controlled by the British. The idea here, of course, was if there was a huge collection of native troops all situated and garrisoned together, then this would increase the likelihood that they could come together as a show of force and try and commit mutiny against the British again. There was also the development of the the part of India that was under the control of the British. 3,000 miles of track were added in the decade following the mutiny. There were significant changes to the administration in terms of educational policy, in terms of government administrative policy, all of which we'll get to in future lessons' time. But really what the Indian Mutiny did was shake up the British Empire. It showed the weakness of British control over the Indian subcontinent, and it also bolstered, in the eyes of the British and in the eyes of everybody who was looking in, the importance of India to the British, given the efforts they went to ensure that they would be able to keep control of India for as long as humanly possible.